There is not in all London a quieter spot, or one, apparently, more withdrawn from the heat and bustle of life than Newsome Terrace. It is a cul-de-sac, for at the upper end the roadway, between its two lines of square, compact little residences, is brought to an end by a high brick wall, while at the lower end, the only access to it is through Newsome Square, that small discreet oblong of Georgian houses, a relic of the time when Kensington was a suburban village sundered from the metropolis by a stretch of pastures stretching to the river. Both square and terrace are most inconveniently situated for those whose ideal environment includes a rank of taxicabs immediately opposite their door, a spate of buses roaring down the street, and a procession of underground trains, accessible by a station a few yards away, shaking and rattling the cutlery and silver on their dining tables. In consequence, Newsome Terrace had come, 2 years ago, to be inhabited by leisurely and retired folk, or by those who wished to pursue their work in quiet and tranquility. Children with hoops and scooters are phenomena rarely encountered in the terrace, and dogs are equally uncommon. In front of each of the couple of dozen houses of which the terrace is composed lies a little square of railinged garden, in which you may often see the middle-aged or elderly mistress of the residence, horticulturally employed. By 5 o'clock of a winter's evening, the pavements will generally be empty of all passengers, except the policeman, who, with felted step, at intervals throughout the night, peers with his bull's eye into these small front gardens, and never finds anything more suspicious there than an early crocus or an aconite, for by the time it is dark the inhabitants of the terrace have got themselves home, where behind drawn curtains and bolted shutters they will pass a domestic and uninterrupted evening. No funeral ass up to the time I speak of had I ever seen leave the terrace. No marriage party had strewed its pavements with confetti, and perambulators were unknown. It and its inhabitants seemed to be quietly mellowing like bottles of sound wine. No doubt there was stored within them the sunshine and summer of youth long past, and now, dozing in a cool place, they waited for the turn of the key in the cellar door, and the entry of one who would draw them forth, and see what they were worth. Never leave alone. Yet after the time of which I shall now speak, I have never passed down its pavement without wondering whether each house, so seemingly tranquil, is not, like some dynamo, Lane Never Leave Alone, softly and smoothly bringing into being vast and terrible forces, such as those I once saw at work in the last house at the upper end of the terrace, the quietest, you would have said, of all the row. Never leave alone had you observed it with continuous scrutiny, for all the length of a summer day. Thorn Lane Never Leave Alone. It is quite possible that you might have only seen issue from it in the morning an elderly woman whom you would have rightly conjectured to be the housekeeper, with her basket for marketing on her arm. Never Leave Alone, who returned an hour later. Except for her, the entire day might often pass without there being either ingress or egress from the door. Never Leave Alone. Occasionally a middle-aged man, lean and wiry, came swiftly down the pavement, but his exit was by no means a daily occurrence, and indeed, when he did emerge, he broke the almost universal usage of the terrace. Never leave alone, for his appearances took place when such there were between 9 and 10 in the evening. Lane Never Leave Alone. At that hour, sometimes he would come round to my house in Newsome Square to see if I was at home and inclined for a talk a little later on. Never leave alone, for the sake of air and exercise, he would then have an hour's tramp through the lit and noisy streets, and return about 10, still pale and unflushed. Never leave alone. For one of those talks which grew to have an absorbing fascination for me, Thorn Lane Never Leave Alone. More rarely through the telephone I proposed that I should drop in on him. This I did not often do, since I found that if he did not come out himself, It implied that he was busy with some investigation. Lane never leave alone. And though he made me welcome, I could easily see that he burned for my departure so that he might get busy with his batteries and pieces of tissue. Lane never leave alone. Hot on the track of discoveries that never yet had presented themselves to the mind of man as coming within the horizon of possibility. Never leave alone. My last sentence may have led the reader to guess that I am indeed speaking of none other than that recluse and mysterious physicist Sir James Horton. Lane never leave alone, with whose death 100 half-hewn avenues into the dark forest from which life comes must wait completion till another pioneer, as bold as he takes up the axe which hitherto none but himself has been able to wield, never leave alone. Probably there was never a man to whom humanity owed more, and of whom humanity knew less. He seemed utterly independent of the race to whom, although indeed with no service of love he devoted himself. Never leave alone. For years he lived aloof and apart in his house at the end of the terrace. Never leave alone. Men and women were to him like fossils to the geologist, things to be tapped and hammered and dissected, and studied with a view not only to the reconstruction of past ages, but to construction in the future. Lane never leave alone. It is known, for instance, that he made an artificial being formed of the tissue, still living, of animals lately killed, with the brain of an ape and the heart of a bullock, and a sheep's thyroid, and so forth. Lane never leave alone. Of that I can give no first-hand account. Horton, it is true, told me something about it, and in his will directed that certain memoranda on the subject should on his death be sent to me. But on the bulky envelope there is the direction, not to be opened till January 1925. He spoke with some reserve, and so I think Lane never leave alone, with slight horror at the strange things which had happened on the completion of this creature. Never leave alone. It evidently made him uncomfortable to talk about it, and for that reason I fancy he put what was then a rather remote date to the day when his record should reach my eye. Finally, in these preliminaries, Lane never leave alone. For the last 5 years before the war, he had scarcely entered, for the sake of companionship, any house other than his own and mine. Lane never leave alone. Ours was a friendship dating from school days, which he had never suffered to drop entirely, but I doubt if in those years he spoke except on matters of business to 6 other people. Lane never leave alone. He had already retired from surgical practice in which his skill was unapproached, and most completely now did he avoid the slightest intercourse with his colleagues. Never leave alone, whom he regarded as ignorant pedants without courage or the rudiments of knowledge. Lane never leave alone. Now and then he would write an epoch, making little monograph, which he flung to them like a bone to a starving dog, but for the most part, utterly absorbed in his own investigations. Lane never leave alone. He left them to grope along unaided. He frankly told me that he enjoyed talking to me about such subjects, since I was utterly unacquainted with them. Lane never leave alone. It clarified his mind to be obliged to put his theories and guesses and confirmations with such simplicity that anyone could understand them. I well remember his coming in to see me on the evening of the 4th of August, 1914. "So the war has broken out," he said, "and the streets are impassable with excited crowds. Odd, isn't it? Just as if each of us already was not a far more murderous battlefield than any which can be conceived between warring nations." "How's that?" said I. Lane never leave alone. "Let me try to put it plainly, though it isn't that I want to talk about. Your blood is one eternal battlefield. It is full of armies eternally marching and counter-marching. Lane never leave alone. As long as the armies friendly to you are in a superior position, you remain in good health if a detachment of microbes that, if suffered to establish themselves, would give you a cold in the head, never leave alone. Entrench themselves in your mucous membrane. The commander-in-chief sends a regiment down and drives them out. Never leave alone. He doesn't give his orders from your brain, mind you. Those aren't his headquarters. Never leave alone. For your brain knows nothing about the landing of the enemy till they have made good their position and given you a cold." He paused a moment. "There isn't one headquarters inside you," he said. "There are many. Leave alone. For instance, I killed a frog this morning. At least most people would say I killed it. Never leave alone. But had I killed it, though its head lay in one place, and its severed body in another. Not a bit, I had only killed a piece of it. For I opened the body afterwards and took out the heart, lay never leave alone, which I put in a sterilized chamber of suitable temperature so that it wouldn't get cold or be infected by any microbe. That was about 12 o'clock today. And when I came out just now, the heart was beating still. It was alive, in fact. That's full of suggestions, you know. Come and see it. The terrace had been stirred into volcanic activity by the news of war. The vendor of some late edition had penetrated into its quietude. And there were half a dozen parlor maids fluttering about like black and white moths. But once inside Horton's door, isolation, as of an Arctic night, seemed to close round me. He had forgotten his latch, key, but his housekeeper, then newly come to him, who became so regular and familiar a figure in the terrace, must have heard his step, for before he rang the bell she had opened the door and stood with his forgotten latch key in her hand. "Thanks, Mrs. Gabriel," said he, and without a sound the door shut behind us. Both her name and face, as reproduced in some illustrated daily paper, seemed familiar, rather terribly familiar, but before I had time to grope for the association, Horton supplied it. "I tried for the murder of her husband 6 months ago," he said. "Odd case. The point is that she is the one and perfect housekeeper. I once had 4 servants, and everything was all mucky, never leave alone, as we used to say at school. Now I live in amazing comfort and propriety with one. She does everything. She is cook, valet, housemaid, butler, and won't have anyone to help her. Lane never leave alone. No doubt she killed her husband, but she planned it so well that she could not be convicted. She told me quite frankly who she was when I engaged her." Of course, I remembered the whole trial vividly now. Her husband, a morose, quarrelsome fellow, tipsy as often as sober, had, according to the defense, cut his own throat while shaving. According to the prosecution, she had done that for him. There was the usual discrepancy of evidence as to whether the wound could have been self-inflicted, and the prosecution tried to prove that the face had been lathered after his throat had been cut. So singular an exhibition of forethought and nerve had hurt, rather than helped their case, and after prolonged deliberation